Please welcome Jerry Brito, Coin Center, Jennifer Shasky Calvary, Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, J. Christopher Giancarlo, CFTC, Benjamin Losky, The Losky Group, and Mark Wiegand, DTCC.
That's a fun song they chose for us. Hello, everyone. My name is Jerry Brito. I'm the executive director of Coin Center. We're an independent nonprofit research center based in Washington, D.C. We're focused on the public policy issues that affect cryptocurrencies. And today we're going to have a great panel to discuss the regulatory spaces that affects blockchain and these other technologies. And I should make a note, Jen Shasky Calvary, who was announced, is not able to make it. She recently stepped down as a director of FinCenter, announced her retirement, and as a result was not able to join us. So let's get right to it. We have only a few minutes. I'm going to start with you, Commissioner Giancarlo. You've taken a very strong interest in distributed ledger technology, and your policy message has been, first, do no harm. What drives this interest, and what opportunity do you see here?
So there's a number of elements to it, but I think the simplest way to describe my interest is to actually take you back to a moment in time where it became clear to me that something like this, although I didn't know what it would be, was tremendously necessary. And that is in September of 2008, days before Lehman Brothers collapsed. At that point, I was a senior executive in the world's largest trading platform, electronic and voice, for over-the-counter swaps, particularly credit default swaps. And in days before, in the middle of that crisis, days before Lehman Brothers fell, we were watching credit spreads on Lehman and a number of the other world's global trading banks gap out hundreds of basis points, indicating real stress in their viability. And we were in conversations then with bank prudential regulators at the Fed and others, asking us questions as to what we were seeing in the marketplace. Where were the credit spreads? How much stress were the trading counterparties under? Whether certain counterparties were not trading with other counterparties. Basically, what signals was the market giving the trading platforms that the regulators didn't have in their data sets? And it became clear to me that at the core of the financial crisis was a lack of visibility by regulators into the counterparty credit exposures of the world's largest trading banks between each other. Now, the regulatory solution for that in Dodd-Frank was to create swap data repositories where information can be gathered and then reassembled to somehow look like the actual trading ledgers of the different financial institutions. And 8 years after the crisis, that's where we are. We're trying to gather that information, clean that data, and reassemble ledgers. And we'll be doing that for a long time to come. And because of the way the world is divided into regulatory regimes by nation state as well as by asset class, for example, we at the CFTC have responsibility for credit default indices, while the SEC has responsibility for credit default swaps, two products that trade in tandem in the real world but are separated in the regulatory world. The point is we will be assembling data, cleaning it, and trying to reassemble trading ledgers forever, I think, without really being able to see what it is, and here's the point, that potentially the blockchain can provide for us. And so I believe there are many reasons to further development of the blockchain. But one very important one is because it can provide regulators with something they didn't have during the financial crisis. I don't believe it would prevent a financial crisis. I don't think that visibility is a risk, is necessarily a risk avoidance, but it's certainly a risk response methodology that's very, very essential.
So as I said before, your message in speeches has been, first, do no harm. What potential regulatory harm could there be, and what specific rules need to change, if any, in this phase?
Well, the harm is death by 1,000 cuts. The financial sector is overseen by many state regulators and a multiplicity of federal regulators before you even get beyond our borders. And yet banking today is a global business. Regulators, banks and financial institutions need to operate across jurisdictions, across regulatory authority. And the worry is that the development of blockchain technology will be hindered by disparate regulation, by regulators looking at it from separate perspectives.
So how do you combat that?
Well, so I've called for a first do no harm approach. And I believe that first do no harm is not something that is only for the CFTC. I believe it's the basis for a global consensus. And it draws upon the very sensible way that the United States went at its regulatory response to the internet. If you go back to 1996, Congress passed the Telecommunications Act. In 1997, the Clinton administration put forward principles for global electronic commerce that established a couple of really core principles. And that is that regulators should first do no harm, and that the private sector, through private contractual arrangements, through industry standard setting, should be the basis for the development of the internet. And while I'm not saying that the blockchain is the same technological evolution as the internet, I do believe that the regulatory response to this technology should borrow a lot from the very enlightened way that the US government went about regulating the internet. And I don't end it with the United States government, because those principles that were laid out by Congress, by the Clinton administration, became pretty much the worldwide standard, certainly for the G20 nations, that adopted that approach. And so when I call for first do not harm, I'm recognizing all of these sandboxes that the UK and Singapore and Japan and others are setting up, and I think that is a very smart way to go about it. But we can't have individual sandboxes. What we need to do is get to the point where all of the global regulators adopt that first do not harm approach, if only for the selfish reason that this is a technology that can provide regulators with the insight into market activities that they didn't have during that critical time back in 2008.
Ben, you made history by creating the first license specifically aimed at digital currency. What was your goal in creating the BitLicense, and do you think you succeeded?
Well, first, thank you for having me, and it's great to be here. And I think I agree with a lot of what the commissioner is saying, and I think that goes back to some of the goals we had, which was we knew that as a banking regulator at DFS, where I used to work, we had certain duties. And I think I agree with a lot of what was just said about internet regulation and its transferability here. I think the one difference is, and that's very true for uses of the blockchain, for example, that are non-financial. I think the one big difference is when back in those days, if you were running a bank on the internet, yeah, you didn't have any internet maybe regulation from the government, but you had banking regulation you had to worry about. And so when we were at DFS, that's what we faced. You had, to the extent blockchain and Bitcoin technology were being used to essentially manage the money of others or move the money of others, there are certain responsibilities that regulators have because one of your number one goals is to make sure that money doesn't disappear, like we saw happen a couple years back at Mt. Gox. So we approached that problem. We knew it was a tricky problem. We had existing regulations that were, I think, written around the time of the Civil War. So needless to say, they were not particularly well suited for Bitcoin and other digital currencies. So we set about trying to figure out whether we could come up with regulations that satisfied some of the same goals we had as a banking regulator: protect consumers, adequate capital standards, making sure the money doesn't disappear, adequate anti-money laundering and Bank Secrecy Act standards, et cetera. And could we do that in a way that would, be better suited for new technologies, and B, could we do it in a way that wouldn't crush these nascent companies in the development of this really important, interesting technology that has continued to change the way the financial system works, I think, little by little. So that was the goal. That's why it took 2 years of going back and forth and thousands of comments. And I think it's still, the regulation exists. How it's turned out, I think the jury is out on that. I'm obviously biased, but I think we'll learn more over time. But the goal was, again, to put the right guardrails in place to protect the system, to protect consumers, but at the same time not squelch this new technology. It's tricky, though.
Yeah. States like California and also the Uniform Law Commission, they're considering approaches that exempt non-custodian uses of cryptocurrency. And you mentioned the BitLicense non-financial exemption. Do you think the BitLicense can be interpreted to do the same? Do you think non-financial means the same thing as non-custodian?
So you just reminded me, I should say that I'm obviously speaking today in my personal capacity and not for the agency I used to work at, for sure. And so I am definitively not the interpreter anymore of those regulations. But I think we certainly did not set out to regulate software or coding. And we wanted to regulate financial intermediaries only. That was our duty. And I think we made pretty clear in multiple iterations of the reg that we were only regulating financial intermediaries. So I think it's fair to say that if you're not a financial intermediary, you shouldn't be covered by the regulation.
Okay. Mark, you were the first to put Bitcoin on the agenda at the CFTC, and you did so in a meeting there. What did you expect when you did that, and how did it turn out? And what did you learn from that experience?
Indeed, you were at that meeting.
Well, I know that.
Well, look, I think, just a little bit of history about what was going on at the time, around the time of the meeting, which was, I think, towards the fall of 2014. Mm-hmm. In the spring, the agency had received a request by one of the exchanges, in this case a swap execution facility, to list a derivative product that was denominator referencing Bitcoin. So I guess first and foremost, we had a responsibility to respond to that request. Obviously, the agency had to inform itself and make sure it understood the technology and understood how the rules that applied to a CEF would be implicated by the listing. So in some ways, it was almost out of necessity. And by that, I mean to say that I think as an agency, the CFTC had a duty to convey to the public that there was this novel set of issues that was being discussed within the agency. It was also an effort to convey to the public. The agency took the responsibility seriously, but also there's an attempt, I think, to try to convey the sense of openness, not only to educating the agency, but openness to the technology itself, and trying to figure out a way that it could be responsibly deployed in the marketplace.
What did you learn? What did you expect? What happened? What did you learn?
Well, I have to say, one of the things that we were really surprised by at the time was the amount of and level of interest in the hearing and in the meeting itself. And as someone else put it, it wasn't the stuff of internet cat videos, but by the standards of meetings hosted by the federal government. I think at the time it was the most widely viewed meeting in the history of certainly the CFTC, and I believe it was the history of the federal government. So, and the thing that was interesting about it is that I think the largest concentration of viewers were actually in Asia. So it was even outside the United States that we're seeing interest. So we're surprised by that. And I guess the only other thing I would add is even back then, comparing how it felt and how things seemed in 2014, and now comparing that to today, here in May of 2016, notwithstanding the clear, extraordinary interest shown back to almost 2 years ago, I'm not sure I would have predicted the sort of interest that seems to persist and remains. And I think it says a lot about the opportunities presented by the technology.
So you're at DTCC now, which has been very forward-leaning on using distributed ledger technology, and you've conducted several proof of concept tests. So you want to tell us what DTCC's interest is and what their vision is to use this?
Yeah, I would say, as far as the overall vision of the company, I think what the company sees as perhaps the two greatest opportunities are, one, this could be a chance to really try and come up with a post-trade infrastructure that doesn't have the same amount of fragmentation and siloed systems that we have today. And the problem with that type of a system, that siloed system, is that, as you can imagine, creates all sorts of inefficiencies and therefore creates all sorts of costs. So DTCC is a company that really is in service to the marketplace. And that's probably really the main opportunity the company sees is to try to use leverage the technology to try to do away with the system of siloed entities scattered throughout the marketplace, and instead have something that's much more integrated and communicates more efficiently. So the second thing I would say is the gains that could be had by way of transparency and accessibility to data. I think that's the other key area that the company.
So do you want to tell us about the tests that you ran and what you learned? Yeah,
so the actual use cases that are being explored right now relate to repo trades, and that's use case number one. The second use case relates to credit events post-trade and single-name CDS. And so the actual experimentation is a little bit further along on the single-name CDS use case. In a matter of weeks, we're going to start to see some actual testing around the repo space. So I think it's important to say, there are resources being devoted to real experimentation, real analysis to really, as it were, kick the tires on the technology.
So I'm going to direct this next question to Commissioner Giancarlo, but I want all of you to feel free to answer. So, as you mentioned before, one of the benefits of distributed ledger technology that you've identified is improved access for regulators to financial market data. Can we be more specific about what exactly that would look like? What you would like to see? What kind of data feeds would you like that would look like? How would you use that?
So in order to talk about what we'd like, let's talk about what we have now.
Yeah.
What we have now is ex post facto data. We have data after the event. We have data sets that have various degrees of completeness to them. We have good data of cleared swaps. We have lacking data for uncleared swaps. Sometimes a trading book that we see may look terribly unbalanced because it may show cleared swaps on the ledger but not show the uncleared swaps. With the remaining information, it may be a much more balanced portfolio. We are, as I say, trying to assemble trading ledgers between parties. What the potential of the blockchain is to see real ledgers in real time across markets, across asset classes. That would be a tremendous step forward. That would be information that we didn't have during the crisis. That would be information that in the event of a future crisis would allow regulators to be much more precise and calibrated in their response to crisis conditions. Doesn't necessarily avoid a failure. Technology is not going to avoid a failure because a failure comes down to how the humans handle it. I was misquoted of saying that I said that blockchain would have prevented Lehman from failing. It wasn't for technology to prevent that. That would have been how regulators responded. But the technology would have given them the transparency into the issues in question in order to make a decision as to whether to allow that firm to fail or to prevent it from failing. So the promise of the blockchain for regulators is to provide that counterparty exposure transparency that was lacking. Now that's only one part of the promise, though, however, because in the wake of the financial crisis, the G20 nations have imposed a whole host of regulatory mandates and requirements and capital requirements on financial institutions, created an enormous amount of operational complexity, of capital constraint and capital complexity. And there too, I think blockchain offers the promise of being able to transcend some of that regulatory and operational complexity that regulators have imposed. So I think regulators have their own reasons, the reasons that help them fulfill their mission to taxpayers, to citizens, to market participants, but also have the reason to see this technology thrive, to allow regulated entities to meet their obligations under regulatory reform measures.
Ben, state banking regulators, of course, are very concerned about solvency. I imagine that this would also help you have a view into the assets of different companies and maybe have different risk profiles for them. You can see exactly what they have.
Yeah, potentially, and it has enormous potential applications to help with anti-money laundering as well. So I think the kind of transparency that the commissioner is talking about is extremely exciting. It's going to take time for, I think, regulators to figure out how to harness it. And I think what you're all going to see over the next few years is regulators who aren't as well-versed, maybe as the commissioner, in what we're talking about today, trying to catch up. They've got lots of other responsibilities, but I think the more they focus on this, the more they'll realize that the blockchain does hold a lot of promise in that respect through its transparency.
You know, Jamie Smith on an earlier panel talked about how important it is for market participants to be able to articulate easily the benefits of the technology and stay away from the jargon. Right. I think there's one way to understand this. Regulators in Ben's former life and my current life have long had access by law and by rule to market participants' books and records. And those books and records have manifested themselves through paper, through other medium. But what blockchain is a way of digitizing those ledgers. Digitizing those letters and be able to transmit that information, be able to see that information in real time. I think from a regulator's point of view, that's a pretty simple concept to get. It's the next technological evolution in a relationship between regulated and regulated entity that is of long standing. But it's the digitization of that relationship.
Right. And Ben, you mentioned this taking some time. You know, there have been a growing number of questions related to the U.S.'s competitiveness here, right? Especially relative to the UK government in particular and their efforts in fintech and the EU generally. You know, the Chancellor of the Exchequer in the UK has said that, you know, quote, this is, you know, getting fintech is a race and they intend to win. And the regulators over there are bending over backwards to attract businesses. You're licensed in the UK, your license is good in every other state in the EU. You have incubators that attract companies, right? AML rules, recently the EU announced that they will not apply AML requirements on software wallets, only on exchanges. So just a question to the whole panel. How is the U.S. faring as far as international competitiveness in this space?
Well, look, I mean, for the most part, let's set aside the wallet question for a second. For the most part, I love what the UK is doing. And I think competition between countries, frankly, competition between states, competition between the states and the federal government, to try and be as innovative as possible as regulators to draw in more companies, to promote innovation, to promote new companies is great. But what you want to avoid, I think, is a regulatory competition that's really just a race to the bottom, that is who can have the lightest touch regulation. That's what we saw, I think, in the years leading up to the financial crisis, and the results were not good. But I do think it's great to have competition where we have smart, thoughtful regulation, but at the same time thinking about how do we promote innovation. So when you see the UK doing the regulatory sandbox, and you see the CFTC trying to, the CFPB trying to do Project Catalyst and do something somewhat similar, that kind of backing and forthing to promote innovation while still wisely regulating, I think is great. When it comes to wallets, I think you have to be careful there to just say we're not going to look at AML for wallets because I assume the assumption there is everything in the wallet has gone through an AML check because it's come through an exchange, let's say. If that were true, I see the argument, that's fine. I'm not sure that everything that ends up in a wallet has been through an AML check. There are various different ways it could come through from around the world. And I would be nervous about saying we're just never going to look at wallets because, again, they are holding the funds of others. And I think you have to be very careful and think that through. When it comes to AML, you don't want to make a mistake. And having, lived through the crisis and lived through a lot of other work around terrorist financing, I think you want to be really careful about your responsibilities as a regulator when it comes to AML.
So Ben disagreed with me before, so I owe you one back, Ben. I'm going to disagree with you slightly on this. I don't really believe that there's a regulatory race to the bottom in sophisticated marketplaces. And the reason I don't believe that is because market participants don't want to go to the least regulated jurisdiction. If they did, then perhaps Zimbabwe might be the financial capital of the world, and I don't mean anything about Zimbabwe. But the fact of the matter is, market participants go to the jurisdictions that have the best regulation, the best balance of regulation. There's a reason why the United States has created the best IPO market in the world, competing every day against Hong Kong and London and other places. And that's because it's perceived to have the best balance of regulation. Certainly no one would say it's an easy jurisdiction to IPO with the disclosure obligations of the SEC and otherwise, but it's perceived to have the best. And similarly, when it comes to state corporate law, Delaware is conceived to have the best balance of investor protections as well as corporate board protections. And so I believe we are in competition amongst jurisdictions like New York, like London, like Hong Kong, every day, day in and day out. And what we must do is have the best balance of regulation. So it's not a big disagreement with what you're saying, but I don't believe the risk is that we'll go so light that the business will flow here. I think actually if we didn't have effective regulation, business would flow to a place where there is perceived to have the best. But I think London is seriously looking to compete with the United States for fintech business. And I think we in the United States need to take that issue seriously and develop our own sandboxes and our own approach to this, because we got it right in the internet. There's no reason why we should expect to get it right again if we don't take steps to make sure we get it right this time around.
So, Mark, DTCC Chief Technology Architect Robert Palatnik, he recently said, quote, "Open source and industry-wide collaboration are essential to realizing the full potential of distributed ledger technology and to avoid creating a disconnected maze of siloed solutions." So how important is interoperability and standardization, and how do we accomplish this?
Well, I think it's critical. I mean, first of all, just to make a plug for Rob. I mean, Rob is our Chief Technology Architect, but he's also really the true thought leader within DTCC about how we should be looking at this technology, how it can be leveraged, and so on. So I think what Rob means, and it actually relates to the question you just asked about the UK and some of Chris's comments about competition or some semblance of that between regulators. As I said before, the opportunity DTCC sees in this technology is doing away with siloed retention of data in order to better ensure that there's some sort of easier way to rationalize and reconcile information between different entities. The same is true of regulators. We've talked a little bit here about swap data repositories. If for some reason or another, based on an insistence on a particular set of standards in the UK, that data kept and reported to a regulator through a note or otherwise has to abide by a certain set of standards, and a different country, let's say it's the United States, takes a different view, we are going to be in the exact same place where we are now with the current framework for swap data repositories. And that's not to say that there aren't necessarily legitimate reasons for the way things are today, because every country has its own public that has representatives that regulators like Chris and Ben and I used to be are accountable to, and that sort of thing. So it helps explain why you see these differences, but nonetheless, it also makes the point that this technology in and of itself is not necessarily a panacea. It does provide this opportunity to harmonize data standards in a way that's really powerful, but it could be undone if you have a a patchwork of different regulation or standards that are insisted upon throughout the globe.
So let me ask Commissioner Giancarlo, in a recent speech, you said that digital or distributed ledger technology offers a promise in allowing U.S. government overseers to transcend the fragmented regulatory structure for providing reference to a single verified record of all financial transactions across regulated markets. So when you say a single verified record, do you mean one universal ledger? And how important will standardization and interoperability be?
Well, that may be somewhat aspirational.
Okay.
I think the goal would be to get to a composite ledger that would provide visibility into the trading counterparties to meet their regulatory needs.
So, okay, but putting technical reasons aside, is there any policy or regulatory reason that would prevent a global, open, decentralized, permissionless ledger like Bitcoin or Ethereum from playing this role?
So you want me to walk into the permissionless, permissioned
It's the last question.
debate.
Come on, make some news.
So, well, as a regulator, it's very important. And by the way, my comments today reflect my own views and not necessarily the views of the Commodity
It's a little late to say that, huh?
but I got it in. It's very important in my role not to be seen to put my finger on the scale of that. I think there is tremendous promise for both sides of that debate. I think there is utilization for both elements of that, and I'd like to see both develop. I think they will fall into their rightful niche, and it may be more than a niche, fall into their rightful place as this important technology develops, and I look forward to seeing it.
But to try to buttonhole you one more time before we leave, is there any reason why either or could serve that role? Any regulatory reason that would prevent one or the other from serving this kind of role?
I'm not aware of one sitting here, but I'm sure there will be a lot of thought going into that from regulators and market participants and law students. So that's going to be an interesting debate in years to come.
And that's why regulation matters to this.
That's why.
Thank you all very much for listening to us. Round of applause for the panel. Thank you. Thanks a lot.